So dear students, as you can see over here, I have in front of me section C of 2020 biology CBSE question paper. So in section C mainly, dear students, the questions are majorly for 3 marks. So let's try and understand each of this question and what exactly is the answer for each of this question. I will try to explain you all in this particular video. Now the question number 1 is basically draw a schematic transverse section of mature anther of an angiosperm and label its epidermis, middle layers, tapetum, endothecium, sporogenous tissue and the connective. So first of all, dear students, here the question is majorly asking us first to draw the schematic section of mature anther of an angiosperm. So let me take you down to the NCERT itself so that you can see the diagram. So this is chapter number 2 of unit number 6, reproduction of 12th standard NCERT biology. And as you all can see that in this particular chapter, the initial part consists of the diagram of flower and what are the different parts of the flower. We will go to directly the explanation of the question which has been asked to us. So whenever such a question comes, dear students, you all should know that this particular, so schematic representation of the anther. So as you can see here, that this particular diagram, part A of the diagram, this is nothing but the TS, that is the transverse section of the anther, correct? So anther of an angiosperm. So as you can see here, that basically this is the transverse section of the anther. Transverse section means if you cut any particular part in a transverse manner, that is in a horizontal manner, right, and you observe it from the top, then what you see inside is nothing but the transverse section. You can also call it as a TS section. So when you observe this TS section of an anther, you can see the inside part like this, something like this, and here they have shown the different layers. Okay, so the question, since they had asked us draw the transverse section of mature anther and label its parts, that is different layers, that is epidermis, middle layer, tapetum, endothecium, sporogenous tissue and the connective. So in this particular diagram, you have to mention these layers. So as you can see that in this particular diagram, they have highlighted this portion of the anther so that they can show the different layers. So as you can see over there, the outermost layer they have shown is epidermis, then below epidermis it is the endothecium, then comes the middle layer, and then the inside, the innermost is the tapetum. Basically inside the tapetum, this particular cells, as you can see, these particular cells are nothing but formed from a particular tissue called as sporogenous tissue. So here precisely they have shown the sporogenous tissue inside the pollen sac. Can you all see here the sporogenous tissue? The sporogenous tissue is basically a diploid tissue which is present inside the pollen sac, and from this basically the microspore mother cells are formed. And microspore mother cells are the initial cells which will ultimately form the pollen grains, dear students. So going back to the question, now I hope that it is clear in your mind. So whenever such a question comes, draw a schematic transverse section, so you have to draw these particular diagram. So you can roughly draw this particular diagram, but this particular part that is showing the 4 layers of the anther is very, very important. So you have to show the 4 layers including the epidermis, endothecium, middle layers and the tapetum. So you'll have to actually practice it once. You try to draw it by looking in the NCERT once, and the second time when you practice the diagram, then you have to try and draw it without looking in the NCERT. So I'm sure that once you draw it by looking in the textbook and the second time when you draw it without looking in the textbook, by this time you will be very much sure or very much confident with the part of the diagram. Okay, dear students, so now going with the second question. The second question is asking us differentiate between wind pollinated and insect pollinated. So here we have to understand that they are asking us what kind of flowers do wind pollinated plants have and what kind of flowers are present in the insect pollinated flowers. So let us go back again to the NCERT, dear students, because I am going to explain you all right from the NCERT so that you know that what to study, because most of the times the students find it very confusing and they refer directly some or the other external outside study source, study material. But dear students, I always recommend that the more and more you are close to your textbook, the more and more you restrict yourself to the textbook, there are more chances that your concepts will be clear. And if your concepts are clear, that will mainly help you in getting good marks. But not only the good marks, also it will help you in actually clearing the NEET exam, which is purely conceptual. So if you talk about the concept of pollination, dear students, what do we mean by pollination? Pollination majorly means it is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma. So that means whenever the pollen grains from one plant are transferred from anther to the stigma of the plant, it is called as pollination. But here there are different ways by which this pollen grain can be transferred, right? So there are different agents which can help in pollination, dear students. So when we talk about agents of pollination, it can be two types of agents. Either it can be biotic or it can be abiotic. So what do you mean by biotic and abiotic? Biotic are nothing but the living agents, the living organisms which are helping in the transfer of pollen grains, whereas abiotic are nothing but the non-living things which are helping in pollination. So in living organisms, basically what are the different types of living organisms which help in pollination? So it can be via the insect, or it can be via the birds, or it can be certain other creatures, like for example snake, ant, etc. So certain names or terms are given for the pollinations. So whenever it is with the help of birds, it is called as ornithophilia, and whenever it is with the help of insects, it is called as entomophilia. Similarly, whenever it is with the help of abiotic agent, that is wind, it is called as anemophily, because these are all Greek words, dear students. So here the word anemone means wind, and whenever it is with the help of water, it is called as hydrophily. So the question was asking us the difference between wind pollinated and insect pollinated flowers. So as you can see over here, that basically the majority of pollination, what you need to have to remember is majority of the pollination which occurs is via the wind pollination. So basically, since wind is one of the most major abiotic agents which contribute to the transfer of pollen grains from one plant to the another. So this is an example given of a tassel, and this is basically an image of a corn plant. Always remember, whenever we talk about the wind pollinated plants, the stigmas are feathery. The reason why they are feathery, because suppose for example they are like feathers, right? So if a pollen grain is coming via the wind to it is coming via the wind, so the stigmas should be able to catch the flying pollen grain. So the moment pollen grains passes through this particular stigma, the stigmas are going to catch them. What about the anthers? Dear students, the anthers of this particular plants, if you can see that here in this particular diagram, it is not very clearly, but still I will try and zoom if we can see the anthers. Okay, so these are all the stamens, these are all the stamens of the plant. So stamens are basically what? Stamens are nothing but the male members of the flower. Basically you can consider them as the male reproductive units of the flower. So the androecium, what we call, and the individual member is known as a stamen. So stamen has got an anther and the filament. So you can see here that this particular portion of the stamen, as you can see the one which has been highlighted, you can see that these are the these are the filament, and this is the anther. So these plants, wind pollinated plants, have basically got versatile anthers. These versatile anther means they can move easily. So you can see that here the anthers can very move easily with the help of wind. So the moment they are extremely light in weight, so they are movable. So if at all the wind comes, immediately the stamens are going to move and the anthers will be released. So that's the purpose of basically having the versatile anthers. So in between you can see there are certain stigmas also. So the stigmas are like the feathery stigmas. The stigmas are, let me zoom it. So the stigmas can be seen, some of them are some of the stigmas you can see in this between. So these are basically the feathery stigmas. So they are like feathers. This entire paragraph, let me highlight for you all so we can read carefully. Okay, so what has it been written, guys? That basically the wind pollinated plants, the pollen grains are light in weight and they are non-sticky. So Of course, since the wind is carrying the pollen grains, so the pollen grains have to be extremely light in weight, right, so that they can float in the air, and they are non-sticky, so they cannot stick to any particular surface. They are extremely smooth, they have a smooth coating, and that's what will be the differentiating factor. So when we go to the insect pollinated plants, there we will see that the pollen grains are sticky because they have to stick to the back of the insect, but in this case, in case of wind pollinated plants, the pollen grains are smooth. Okay, so remember that. And as we just now said, that this is an example of a corn cob. This is a cob, and these are the basically the stamens as well as the stigmas which are there. So how are the stigmas? Remember, as you can see over here, it has been mentioned that they often possess well exposed stamens and large, often feathery stigma to easily trap the airborne pollen grains. So how are the stigmas? They are feathery. Okay. Now let's go ahead, guys. Going ahead, let's talk about now since they had asked us the difference between the wind and the insect pollinated flowers, let's talk about the insect pollinated flowers now. So dear students, you can see over here the example of an insect pollinated flower. This is a picture of an insect pollinated flower, and you can see here basically there is this particular insect which is basically a moth, which is helping in the pollination process. So how are the insect pollinated flowers, dear students? As we said, first of all, the insect pollination is called as entomophilia, because the word insect, the word entomon is a Greek word which means insect. How are the flowers of this particular plant? Flowers in case of insect pollinated plants are large, colorful, fragrant, and rich in nectar. So it has been mentioned that how are the flowers, guys? Here you have to understand, guys, that it is an example of, you can say, co-evolution, or you can also consider it as mutualism. How is it mutualism? What do we mean by mutualism? Here I am trying to explain you the other concept, which you will of course study in the chapter called as organisms and populations. So here mutualism means that both the organisms are helping one another. Like for example, here the moth is helping the flower by helping in pollination, but at the same time the flower is helping the moth by giving its nectar. Insect is getting nourishment from the flower, and the flower is getting benefited due to pollination. The flower is getting benefited by the insect because the insect is helping in pollination. So I can highlight it over here that in case of the insect pollinated plants, the pollen grains have a sticky coating. So they secrete some chemical because of which the outer coating of the pollen grain is sticky in nature. And why is it sticky, guys? Because obviously when the insect comes to the flower for pollination, and the moment it goes inside the flower to suck the nectar, so at that time what pollen grains from the anther can stick to the back of the insect, and whenever basically the same insect goes to the another flower again for the purpose of taking the nectar, those those pollen grains can again basically stick to the stigma of the other flower. So I hope now you have understood the difference between the pollination, wind pollinated and insect pollinated flowers. Okay, now let's go ahead and try and answer the next question. The next question is, generally it is observed that human males suffer from hemophilia more than human females, who rarely suffer from it. Explain giving the reasons. Okay, a very beautiful question, dear students. Generally it is observed. So this question has come from the chapter Principles of Inheritance. So let's try and answer the question. Principles of Inheritance. Okay, so now straight away we are going to the part which is basically the Mendelian disorders. So what are Mendelian disorders, guys? Whenever the disorder is because of the defect in the gene, such kind of disorders are called as Mendelian disorders. But dear students, always remember that these Mendelian disorders can be, again, as we said, it is because of a defective gene, but the gene which is responsible for that particular defect, it can be present on the autosome or it can be present on the sex chromosome. So likewise, there are different types of disorders. So here, as you can see, that hemophilia. Now hemophilia is basically what? Hemophilia is because of a defect in a gene which is responsible for the formation of clotting factors. This particular gene, which is responsible for formation of clotting factors, this gene is present on the X chromosome, and that's the reason why, dear students, this is basically a X-linked disorder. So as you can see, it has been mentioned in the textbook that this sex-linked recessive disease, sex-linked means the gene which is responsible for this particular condition, hemophilia, is present on the X chromosome, and that's why it is called as a sex-linked recessive disease. Now let us try and understand. The question was asking us that it is more frequent in the males than the human females. What is the reason? So what is the reason for that? Now the reason why, dear students, the males are more suffering from this particular thing is because, as we said, that the gene is present on the X chromosomes. Now if you notice that humans, the males only have X and Y chromosome, whereas the females have two X chromosomes. Now since this is a recessive condition, so let's say for example a female who is having one recessive gene for hemophilia, since it is a recessive gene, so if she is having one recessive gene of hemophilia on one X chromosome, but the other X chromosome has a normal gene which is mainly forming the gene clotting factor. So if the female has one normal gene which is forming the clotting factor and one recessive gene for hemophilia, in that condition the female will be a carrier of that particular gene or the carrier of that particular disease. So in short, the female will be normal female. She won't be suffering from hemophilia. Only in certain conditions she might show the symptoms of hemophilia. But now if you talk about the male, guys, in case of male, if the X chromosome of the male has got the recessive gene for hemophilia, but now here, dear students, the male does not have an extra chromosome. The male cannot have a normal gene for a clotting factor because there is only one X chromosome, and this gene for hemophilia or this gene for clotting factor is not present on the Y chromosome. So that means if the male has got even a single gene which is present on the X chromosome, which is defective and which is not able to form the clotting factor, so in that case, even if the male has got a one X-linked recessive gene of hemophilia, the male will suffer from basically the hemophilic condition, or he will suffer from hemophilia. So that's why, dear students, the chances are more males can suffer from this particular condition of hemophilia. Suppose if a carrier mother marries to a normal father, let's assume a condition where a carrier mother is marrying to a normal father. In that case, dear students, 50% of the male children will get one recessive gene which is coming from the mother. So all those 50% of the males who are getting the recessive gene from the mother are going to suffer from hemophilia. Whereas the 50% of the daughters who get the X chromosome from the mother, who get the X-linked recessive gene from the mother, will not suffer from hemophilia because they are getting the normal X chromosome from the father also. So that's the reason why we can consider that basically here more males will suffer from hemophilia. So dear students, we have covered 3 questions from CBSE 2020 biology question paper. I hope you have understood the concept of today's questions. If you have any doubts, please put it in the comment section. You can also mail me on my email ID. I have put it in the description box. If you have understood the concept, dear students, please like, share and subscribe to One Page Biology. I'll be coming up with the explanation of other questions in my coming videos. Till that time, this is Praful signing off. See you all in the next video, guys. Take care. Thank you so much. Bye bye.